After being chased by an ambulance that captures people in the street and takes them to a secret laboratory, a young cartoonist investigates the appearance of this mysterious diabolical hospital car. Today we're going to recap the story of the movie, The Ambulance, from 1990. In the middle of the streets of New York, a comic book artist called Josh goes to lunch with his friend. On the way, they chat about Spider-Man stories, until Josh sees a young woman pass by, who had caught his eye the other day, and gathers the courage to talk to her. After following her down the street, the designer catches up with her, introduces himself and then asks her out. As expected, the young woman doesn't accept the invitation from a stranger, but Josh does everything he can to break the ice and gradually wins her over. On the way, the young woman begins to feel ill due to her diabetes and collapses in the middle of the street. Josh immediately helps her and promises to stay by her side, but nearby, an unknown man sees what has happened and, from inside his limousine, sends for an ambulance. Minutes later, the ambulance arrives at the scene and takes the young woman away, who finally reveals her name, Cheryl. Josh is willing to accompany her, but the nurses won't let him in, but he promises to meet her at the hospital after the service. Hours later, Josh is at his workplace, which is none other than Marvel Comics. After finishing his shift, he asks Stan Lee himself to leave early because he's meeting his new friend in hospital. The head of Marvel allows him to leave and Josh finally arrives at the hospital, carrying a bouquet of flowers for Cheryl. He asks the attendant about her, but there's no one there by that name or description. He then talks to one of the nurses, who tells him to look for his friend in a nearby hospital. Josh follows the advice, but when he gets there, no one knows about the girl and things only get more complicated, as he doesn't know her surname. Unfortunately, Cheryl has been captured and taken to a secret laboratory where a mysterious doctor is experimenting on his victims. The girl screams for help, but she's trapped on a stretcher and the doctor covers her mouth so as not to agitate the other patients. Meanwhile, Josh goes to the police station and tells the whole story to Frank, a grumpy lieutenant who isn't a big fan of comic books. Even so, Josh hands him a sketch of Cheryl, along with a drawing of the ambulance that took her. However, as he doesn't know her surname, neither his testimony nor the drawings are of much help to the investigation. Josh then leaves the police station, but before he does, he is approached by police officer Sandra, who promises to help him, as long as he gets more evidence. Josh promises to gather evidence about the suspicious disappearance, but the next day he calls the city's hospitals, but no one knows Cheryl's whereabouts. This situation makes him nervous, which also ends up affecting his work at Marvel. Stan Lee reprimands him for this, saying that Josh is late delivering the stories of the publisher's new superhero, Dr. Strong. The artist promises he'll get everything done on time and his boss tells him he'd better, or he could miss out on a great opportunity at Marvel. Josh continues with his work, but during his break, he goes around New York showing posters of Cheryl, hoping that someone will know where she is. After a lot of searching, he finally finds the young woman's roommate who, coincidentally, is also diabetic and, when she hears about it, calls Cheryl. Unfortunately, Josh's story proves to be true when his friend hears a message on her answering machine, in which Cheryl asks for help. After that, the roommate asks Josh to go with her to a stable at night, where Cheryl works to earn extra money. The girl goes in to see if her friend is there, but she is captured inside the stable and screams for help. The cartoonist rushes to help her, only for the ambulance that captured Cheryl to come through the gate at the same moment. Luckily, Josh manages to swerve before being run over, but the ambulance also picks up the girl and takes her to the doctor's lab. Josh then returns home and tries to contact Lieutenant Frank during the night, but the officer doesn't return his calls. The next morning, the cartoonist wakes up tired and drinks some milk, but as he does so, he begins to feel very ill. He leaves the apartment and asks the neighbors for help, but his situation becomes so serious that they decide to call an ambulance. Fearing that it's the same ambulance that picked up Cheryl and her friend, Josh refuses to go, but the nurses soon show up and take him away on a stretcher. When he wakes up in hospital, Josh has a nervous breakdown and tries to run away, but Lieutenant Frank appears shortly afterwards and controls the situation. With everything explained, Frank says he will leave Josh in the care of the hospital supervisor, as he still has more questions to ask. What's more, Josh's unconvincing story about the missing girls has made him one of the suspects in the case. With no other choice, Josh is forced to stay in the hospital bed and soon meets his roommate. The guy is an old man called Elias, who has been in the hospital for years, but was once an investigative journalist. He heard the whole conversation and suspects that the young cartoonist is the main suspect in the disappearances. Josh tries to convince him that Cheryl was picked up by an ambulance, just like her friend in the stable, but the old man doesn't believe it. Their conversation is interrupted by the hospital supervisor, who gives Josh a sedative to help him sleep at night. Hours later, an ambulance arrives at the hospital, bringing along a policeman, who asks where Josh is. He says that the patient will be transferred to another hospital and the supervisor asks for the documents to authorize the transfer. The policeman goes to get the papers and the woman grabs a coffee from the kitchen, but he takes advantage of her distraction and uses his baton to attack her. After that, 2 more henchmen appear, dressed as nurses, and go to Josh's room to take him away. The cartoonist is still unconscious because of the sedative and the nurses easily place him on the stretcher. But old Elias finds this strange and runs up to the guys, demanding an explanation. The policeman soon joins the nurses and tries to stop the old man, but Elias is undeterred, activates the fire alarm and goes after the 3 of them alone. The confusion causes all the patients to leave their rooms, forcing the policeman and the nurses to flee, while Elias takes Josh back to his room. Shortly afterwards, a hospital nurse appears and asks if they know what happened, but Elias disguises it by saying that neither of them has left the room. The nurse then tells them that the supervisor is missing and the strangest thing is that she left her insulin injection on the counter. Upon hearing this, Josh soon notices a pattern between her, Cheryl and her roommate, as all 3 of them were captured by the ambulance and were diabetic. Elias then decides to help Josh solve this case, as it could lead to the best news story of his career. The 2 change clothes and head out the door of the hospital, but on the way, they run into a guard. Elias quickly pretends to be grieving over the perishment of his supposed wife, while Josh poses as his son and, thanks to this farce, they both manage to get past the guard. Outside the hospital, the pair take a cab to the New York Post to research cases of missing diabetics. When they get there, they come across an ambulance parked nearby and Elias calls Josh to investigate the car. As they approach, the 2 notice that no one is around and Elias tries to take pictures with his old camera, but it doesn't work. While he tries to fix it, Josh goes to a public phone and calls Lieutenant Frank. The sketch artist passes on the information to the policeman and in the meantime, Elias fixes his camera and goes off to take pictures of the ambulance by himself. After recording everything on the camera, the old man prepares to return, but a strange green light illuminates his face and it comes from inside the ambulance. From inside the car, the 2 nurses and their colleague, who was previously disguised as a policeman, appear. The 3 of them force Elias to hand over the camera, but he prefers to throw it into the river and punches one of the men in the face. Despite his courage, the trio leave him unconscious and put him in the ambulance. Minutes later, Josh finishes talking to the lieutenant and looks for Elias, but soon realizes that his friend has been captured. Even so, the old man still left the photographic film at the crime scene, so that Josh can develop the photos for the police. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Frank is about to arrive at the location informed by Josh, but halfway there, he sees the ambulance leaving at high speed and begins to chase it. Frank quickly sets off his car's siren and forces the ambulance to stop on the roadside. After that, he orders the guys to open the back doors and show the patient, who is completely covered in a white bag. The lieutenant removes the blanket and finds another nurse, who wakes up and attacks the policeman with a knife in his chest. Frank falls wounded and the trio escape in the ambulance, but the policeman gets up, grabs his pistol and starts shooting at the vehicle. The ambulance then turns around and speeds towards the policeman, who continues to shoot, but is run over and falls lifeless to the ground. The nurses then place his body on the stretcher and flee back to the laboratory. Meanwhile, Josh returns to the Marvel studio and is soon visited by police officer Sandra. She tells him that Frank is missing and Josh believes that, on the way to find him, the ambulance probably captured him, just as it did Elias. The policewoman then calls the police station, asking for information on the registration of the ambulance and is told to look for it in a junkyard in the city. The next morning, Josh goes there and gets a list of the cars that have been there. Thanks to this, he finds the license plate number of the ambulance, along with the owner's address and goes to a public telephone to tell Sandra everything. She says she'll check whether the information is true or not. After the call, Josh leaves the phone booth, but to his misfortune, he finds himself surrounded by a gang of young thugs. The cartoonist tries to defend himself, but he is outnumbered and soon knock him down with several punches and kicks, leaving him unconscious. Hours later, Josh wakes up injured and to make matters worse, the dreaded ambulance shows up to take him away. He tries to resist, but he's too injured and the nurses easily strap him onto the stretcher. Josh fears for the worst, but the same gang that attacked him earlier reappears to see what's going on. Josh seizes the opportunity and tries to provoke the thugs, saying that the ambulance has invaded their territory and that they may have valuable medicines inside the car. The gang falls for it and, even though the nurses tell them to get lost, the thugs start attacking them. Unfortunately for them, the supposed nurses are much stronger and beat up the whole gang. Josh's plan doesn't work and he is put into the ambulance, which speeds off down the road. As a result, the car starts to sway and a suitcase that was next to Josh falls next to him. Even though he's tied up, Josh manages to grab the case with his foot and uses his mouth to pull something out that might help him get free. However, all he finds is a jacket with the name Vint on it, and then his only chance is to force the stretcher against the ambulance doors in order to get out. After a lot of effort, he manages to open the doors and, when the ambulance goes up a hill, he climbs out of the car. However, he is still trapped in the stretcher and it speeds off down the road. In front of him, two cars are passing at a crossroads and luckily Josh overtakes them, escaping unharmed. Finally, the stretcher collides with several garbage cans and overturns on the ground. But this blow is enough to loosen the restraints and Josh manages to free himself. Even so, the nurses notice that he has escaped and run to catch him. The designer runs towards a factory and inside, he asks one of the workers for help, who tells the intruder to get out of there. Soon afterwards, the two nurses also enter the factory and the worker tells them to leave, but they soon finish the guy off. After that, they go back to chasing Josh, who goes down a spiral staircase and hides in the middle of huge iron tunnels. One of the nurses follows him and finds him between the pipes, but thanks to the narrow space, Josh manages to defend himself with punches and kicks. With the nurse bewildered, Josh runs to the end of the tunnel and throws himself against the iron railing in order to get out. He falls with it on the other side of the road and narrowly misses being hit by two cars passing by. After this scare, Josh continues to run towards a park and, ironically, he finds himself at the scene of another crime, where the police are investigating the perishment of a young woman. The sketch artist shouts for help and the two detectives, McCloskey and Ryan, believe he is a possible witness. They take him to the police station and Josh explains that he was running away from two nurses who captured people in an ambulance, but the detectives want to know about the crime in the park. Seconds later, Sandra shows up at the police station to talk to Josh, but the detectives prevent her from interfering in the interrogation. Even so, she says she's discovered that 11 diabetic people have been captured in recent weeks and that this has something to do with the ambulance case. The detectives then let her talk to Josh for a few minutes and he tells Sandra about the jacket with the letters Vint which he found in the ambulance. Sandra promises to investigate further, while Josh continues at the police station. Meanwhile, in the secret laboratory, the mad doctor keeps Elias strapped to the stretcher. The old man questions the intentions of the doctor, who says he is bound by the limits of modern medicine and therefore secretly carries out his experiments on diabetic patients in order to profit from the results. Elias says he's not diabetic, but the doctor wants to use him as collateral to publicize his scientific experiments when the time is right. The old man tries to resist, but the doctor punches him in the face and injects him with a substance that makes him squirm in pain. Far away, Sandra continues to search for clues in the police files. She accidentally spills coffee on the papers, but while trying to clean it up, she finds a reference to the word Vint, which doesn't refer to a person, but to a nightclub called Vintage. The policewoman goes there and, as she feared, finds the dreaded ambulance inside the nightclub. Immediately, she calls the police station and asks for help, but the person who answers is Detective McCloskey, who doesn't want to hear the story and hangs up the phone, even though Josh asks to speak to her. Instead, he and his colleague continue to insist that Josh give his statement about the crime in the park and the cartoonist decides to play their game. He says that it was the two nurses Sandra is investigating who eliminated the girl in the park and that they need to go to the nightclub where she is. The detectives agree to take him to the nightclub and have to hurry because Sandra is in trouble. In the middle of the crowd, two guys try to catch her eye and, to disguise it, she agrees to dance with one of them. However, the guy shows that he wants to be more intimate than he should and Sandra finishes him off by headbutting him in the nose. Afterwards, she goes to the microphone, introduces herself as a policewoman and asks for everyone's help in finding the ambulance criminals. The nightclub patrons think it's all a hoax, but Sandra shoots several times into the air with her gun to prove she's not joking. Minutes later, the detectives arrive at the scene and Josh leaves as soon as possible to find Sandra. Inside the nightclub, he sees the policewoman and runs over to her, but just as he does, the ambulance speeds towards him, driven by the mad doctor. Josh narrowly manages to escape, but the ambulance comes back to crush him and he is forced to swerve quickly. The doctor starts driving the ambulance all over the nightclub, destroying everything around him and running over everyone who crosses his path. Finally, he finds himself surrounded by several armed police officers and is forced to flee, driving his car through the wall and out onto the road. The doctor has left, but Sandra, Josh and the two detectives decide to look for evidence on the second floor of the nightclub. There, they find the doctor's secret laboratory and some nurses show up with guns, but Sandra and the other cops eliminate them all. After that, they find dozens of hospital beds and in them are the victims of the doctor's experiments. After searching them all, Josh finally finds Cheryl in bed and is happy to see her safe. The young woman says that the doctor injected her with a chemical substance, but her body rejected it and she could perish. Josh promises that the doctors will take care of her, and then Cheryl thanks him and, to his unpleasant surprise, she asks Josh to call her boyfriend and let him know that she's okay. Devastated to learn that the girl was already engaged, Josh nevertheless promises to pass the information on to him. The designer goes to another part of the lab, disappointed, and Sandra tries to comfort him, showing that she has feelings for him. She says she's going to call Cheryl's boyfriend herself, but on one of the pillars, one of the ambulance nurses appears, disguised as a policeman. He rushes Sandra and threatens to hit her with a knife, but the policewoman counters with a sharp blow that leaves him bewildered. The undercover cop tries to fight back, but at the same moment, Elias appears, pounces on the man and knocks him to the ground. Josh is happy to see that his friend is okay, and Elias soon promises to work on his news story, which is sure to win him an important prize. Shortly afterwards, Josh and Sandra leave the detectives to investigate the scene and go to rest for the night. However, the two decide to go out in style and take a limousine to the designer's apartment. On the way, Josh also shows that he has grown fond of the policewoman over the course of this adventure, and the two of them head to the apartment to enjoy the moment. However, Josh loses his keys when he's attacked by the junkyard gang and, to make matters worse, the ambulance reappears and hits him and Sandra on the sidewalk. The policewoman falls unconscious, but Josh gets up and tries to run down a dark alley. The ambulance follows in his wake and he tries to escape by jumping out of a dumpster, but the doctor crashes his car into it, knocking Josh onto the hood. The doctor continues to accelerate the ambulance, while attacking Josh with his hand through the windshield. Josh manages to break free and continues running down the street, until he comes up against a huge fence. He manages to climb it and sees, on the other side, a huge hole in a construction site. Then the doctor appears with the ambulance in front of him and warns him, through the car's microphone, that he will make him pay for interfering in his plans. Josh takes advantage of the fact that the villain doesn't know what's on the other side of the fence and taunts him, daring him to run him over. The doctor decides to grant his wish and speeds the ambulance towards the fence, but when he crosses it, the car crashes into the hole and the ambulance explodes completely due to the impact. Finally, the danger is over and Josh is taken to the ambulance, which this time is a real one. There, he meets Sandra who, although injured, is safe on the stretcher. The two decide to end the evening with a kiss, but the restraints on the stretcher prevent them from getting any closer. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.